Hello, ready for the next episode in our exciting story of Louisiana history. So, when we last left the situation, the company had collapsed. It was still under French control, but it had now gone back to the royalty. So it was in royal hands once again. It'll remain so for three royal governors, after which Louisiana will become Spanish, and that'll be a result of the French and Indian War. So the company surrendered Louisiana colony back to the crown. There was no way they could maintain it after all that had occurred. So France would have to again appoint a governor. It would also have to finance this expensive adventure, which had proven an intractable problem from the very beginning. As a result, they decided to go back to Bienville. They couldn't afford the expense, but at the same time, they couldn't afford to abandon the colony. So the result was neglect more than anything else. So they continued to underfund the colony just so long as they had a presence there, which made life extremely difficult for the poor individuals that were trying to maintain the life there. This would be the case, as I said, until 1763, when finally the colony turns over to Spain. The problems will persist. The Natchez Indians who survived the Natchez War, those who were able to get away, went to live among the Chickasaws. The Chickasaws had always been enemies of the French. They had been allied with the British. And as British influence extended further to the west, and especially among the Native Americans in those territories, they turned these Native Americans against the French. So they continued to terrorize these French settlements on the outskirts. The Natchez Wars frightened the settlers, as you can imagine, after the slaughter that took place. And many fled to the city of New Orleans for protection. You remember, it's a walled city. And they wouldn't leave. They were afraid to leave. They were afraid to go back to their farms in the open frontier because they knew they were vulnerable to attack and they feared another massacre. However, within the city itself, with the overcrowding, there was little food. The food came in from the farms on the exterior. And since the exterior was being evacuated, there was no way that they could feed all the people within the city itself. There weren't any jobs. There wasn't sufficient housing. So as a result, the city of New Orleans was facing a significant crisis as it stood. Corruption became abundant, as generally happens when you have that sort of social breakdown. Government advantage. Officials took advantage of colonists to make what profits they could. Inflation increased tremendously. Life had become extremely difficult. Even the leadership itself was at odds with one another. The members of the Superior Council, which was in essence the ruling group at that time, started fighting amongst themselves over what should be done and how it should be done. So chaos had now broken out. Solutions? In 1732, they reorganized the Superior Court and hoped to put new people in there who wouldn't be fighting amongst themselves. The king exempted the colonies from all duties of commerce between Louisiana and France. By removing the taxes, he hoped it would provide some help for the economic distress that the colony was facing. Governor Perrier lost interest in operating the colony. He likely wanted to get out if possible. He became harsh and brutal. As a result, he got what we wanted. He was forced to be removed. Bienville, who is now in France, was once again named governor. This will be his fourth time at bat. And he was also named Commandant General, which gave him control not only of the civil authority, but the military authority as well. He would have a free hand in everything. In essence, the crown is just turning to Bienville and giving everything to him and saying, you solve it. They were heard. They were thrilled. The citizens like Father Bienville, only man who they felt fully understood the problems of the colony. And if there was anybody there who could help them, it would be him. So they were anxious for his to return. He had his faults, but he had a wide knowledge and experience both not only in the colony itself and how it operated and what resources were available, but also his relations with the local Indians. And they felt that since these were the underlying problems, his general authority and responsibility would solve the problem. So here we have Governor Bienville. He's overdue. He's set to arrive in New Orleans, and everyone is excited. They just can't wait for him to get here and solve their problems. But time passed. Bienville never showed. But time passes. They become deeply concerned. What happened? Had he died along the way? Had the ship he was on been sunk? Had it been taken by pirates? All sorts of rumors start circulating around the city as to why it was that Bienville had yet to arrive. What could it have been? Something definitely must have happened along the way. They sent out ships to search in the Gulf to find if there were any wreckage or any indication or any knowledge of what could have happened to Bienville's ship. These ships returned. No news. Desperation set in as well as despair. Finally, in the spring of 1733, an old and somewhat yellow complexioned man of 60 years old stood on the deck of a French ship that just arrived. This was Bienville. When he first arrived, he was 18. He's now 60. He's tired, but he had returned. Conditions he found were apathetic, disorganized, and poor population. Food was incredibly scarce. Buildings had not been repaired for a number of years, despite the hurricanes and other storms that had happened. They were left partially in ruins. The city was just in tatters from neglect. Military equipment was in disrepair. Some of it was so old it was almost useless to repair or to even fix. They had 800 soldiers, which is not a bad number, but they were living in the most unsanitary conditions, dilapidated barracks. They were underfed. Their uniforms hadn't been changed in years. And again, their equipment was very obsolete. They weren't an effective fighting force. In fact, two-thirds were on the sick list, which is indicative of the attitude of the men there. Meantime, the Indian problems were starting to grow. The Chickasaw were becoming even more aggressive at the behest of the British, and the Alabamas were joining with them. So the major tribes immediately to the east of the French experience, the French claim, were now becoming very restive and very aggressive. Most colonists, when asked, wanted to go home. They'd given their all here, and they saw no hope. There was no point in staying. Bienville immediately started rebuilding the colony and protecting it from Indians. He imposed order as only his authority could do. People would listen to Bienville. He had the soldiers rebuild their barracks and repair their arms. You can do this. You're responsible. You don't wait for somebody else to help you. We have to step up to meet the challenges ourselves. Citizens were drafted to work in the hospital. So many people were sick, get them well. So he drafted people to work and get these people on their feet again. He needed any laborer he could get for his hands on. Food supplies were gathered and they were rationed on the basis of real need. It's not a question of hoarding that was out or people with more wealth living well while the rest had nothing. He rationed food to everyone equally to make sure everyone got something proper to eat to get their strength back up. Defense, this is his quote. There is only one or two men among them who's above 5 feet. Of 52 years sent me, one half have already been whipped for larceny. In a word, they are useless beings not worth the food bestowed upon them. They are burdens to the colony, and from them no efficient military service can be expected. This is the reinforcements that Bienville received from the French government. So you can realize that the situation in Louisiana had really deteriorated. This is the area, this map is an old map, shows the influence here of the Chickasaw control. Here are the Alabamas up in this area here, and this is the Chickasaw land up here. Chickasaw Bluffs which is right along this area here, is about where Memphis was. So they, in essence, were shutting off the trade from Canada to Louisiana. So they were, in essence, in trying to isolate the Louisiana colony, the southern Louisiana colony around the city of New Orleans. This map here shows some of the other ones. This is the Chickasaw up here. These are the Alabamans, and you can see these other tribes along the side here, the Natchez, the Tunica, the Biloxi. But these were the two biggest tribes, and those are the ones most influenced by the British in moving westward against the French. The Chickasaw War of 1736 sent word to Chickasaw chiefs to bring in the heads of the Natchez Indians who participated in the massacre of the French. Remember the old relationship we talked about among the Native Americans, that if the Native American tribe moved in with another tribe, they became part of that tribe. Bienville wanted to punish the Natchez who had killed the French in the massacre. But from the Native perspective, these tribes, these members of the Natchez tribe, had moved in with the Chickasaw, and so now they were Chickasaw. And Bienville had absolutely no right to ask for retaliation against the Chickasaw. They had done nothing, so they refused. As a result, he demanded that the Natchez be turned over to them, which again looked at him and said, no, this is a violation of our traditions. There are no Natchez here. You may think they are, but once they came to us, they became Chickasaw. He then responded by a major attack, and he accomplished this with the hope of cooperative effort from Major Doquette from Illinois territory. He would bring troops down to Mississippi. Bienville would bring troops up to Mississippi. Their combined efforts would punish the Chickasaw and accomplish what they were after. He went to Mobile also to gain the assistance of the Choctaw Indians in this. He returned to New Orleans and organized a militia of locals, free blacks, and slaves, promising the slaves freedom if they joined. He was amassing a major army. These are some of the Chickasaw warriors. The war begins. He arrives at Chickasaw Fort with his Choctaw reinforcements. The Indians attack, but they get repulsed and driven away. He takes note of an English flag and notices that the fences are of British design. He now realizes that the Chickasaw are firmly under the control of the influence of the English, using English weapons and techniques. After a brief siege, he realizes that he's not matched to the situation, so he's forced to withdraw. D'Artet arrives late. He looks for Bienville and he can't find him. He decides to attack on his own and is roundly defeated. He himself is wounded. His Indian allies leave him, and he'll eventually die of his wounds. 46 soldiers stayed with Doquette. They were overwhelmed, tortured, and skinned. So much for the reinforcements that Bienville was expecting. This totally horrified Bienville. He then organizes a second attack. He organizes and builds a much larger army, even sought some help from France. The army consists of slaves, free blacks, Marines, Indians, and French soldiers. In 1739, it begins its march. They built Fort St. Francis near Chickasaw villages, and he concentrated all of his troops there to get ready for a strike. But then food shortages set in. There's not sufficient supplies of food. With that comes diseases. From the diseases comes famine. They start eating their own horses. And as a result, men become disaffected and then start leaving the battlefield. Bienville sought then a meeting with the Chickasaw to try to work out. Surprisingly, the Chickasaw were tired of the threats as well. So they made peace. And some of the people that were British agents among them, they surrendered them to the French. So in April of 1740, the official war ended, but sporadic violence on the frontier would persist. By this time, Bienville's tired. He spent the last 3 years just in routine matters, trying to hold the colony together and trying to get it to function as best as he could. He encourages agriculture. He makes people leave the city, saying that, look, most of the Indian problem has been solved. You've got to leave. You've got to go to your plantations. You've got to start raising food. You've got to start living. Jean Louis, who's the founder of the charity hospital, provides when he dies. He's a sailor who dies and leaves money for charity hospital. And Bienville sees that the hospital is built. He sent supplies to the Gulf Coast after another hurricane had struck to help in the Mobile area. He established settlements on the Red River and at St. Francisville. He's attempting to revitalize the colony as best he can. He rendered help in an epidemic of mad dogs struck the Gulf Coast. That's something we don't think about nowadays, but rabies was known, and dogs would get it and spread it around by attacking and biting people. And there's no cure for rabies. Even today, I think they can give you shots to try to deflect it, but for the most part, it's the symptoms which kill you. His failure to sue the Czechoslovaks totally, and the loss of so many of his dear friends from the Natchez Wars to this point in time was more than he could bear. He had spent 40 of his 60 years in Louisiana, and he was done. He was ready to go. So as a result, he retires and goes back to France. Pierre-Francois Regard Carbonel, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, takes over. This is the Marquis. He's referred to as the Grand Marquis. Vaudreuil was the second governor after the return of the colony to the king. He arrived in 1743. He was the son of a very vain, arrogant, imperious, and jealous governor of Canada. And in some ways, he resembled his father. They were very much elitists, very much authoritarian aristocrats who believed that people, commoners, were below them and had to listen to what they commanded. He was extremely elegant in his manners. He loved big, magnificent dinners and balls, formal ceremonies, and military displays. All of these expressions of his authority he reveled in, and he loved them. And he did bring an element of that to New Orleans. In fact, much of the Mardi Gras and the celebratory attitude New Orleanians have are a bit of an outflow from the administration of Vaudreuil. But it was a thin cover of civilization over the chaos that lied beneath. He maintained a fashionable court in New Orleans with all the pomp and circumstance one would expect in Paris itself. But there wasn't a depth of support for this. This was only the very few people at the top of the community who enjoyed this. Of course, others appreciated the fun and the experience of seeing it happen. It was like Mardi Gras in some regards. It was a spectator event, but it didn't solve the fundamental problems of the colony itself. Bienville, who was a very quiet man and not a man of ceremony, when Vaudreuil arrived, he gave him a very simple inauguration, got on a ship and left, which kind of outraged Vaudreuil because as a new governor, he expected a tremendous welcoming ceremony to establish him in his new position. He inherited two problems. The Indian problem on the frontier persisted. And within the administration, there's a lot of backbiting and backstabbing, which he had to contend with. He was calm and he soothed the internal conflicts. I guess his elegant manner about him did have a bit of a calming effect. People respected him, I guess, because they saw him as being of a higher caliber, what have you. His wife was a woman of extreme elegance. She had brought into the city her coach with 4 horses, and she would travel around the city well dressed in this coach driven by his driver with all the elegance of a queen almost. It kind of gave people something to look up to, something positive in a way, but it was all ceremony. It was highly unrealistic as to what the situation was. When they held parties, of course, everyone was interested in going. So it was a distraction. And people had parties and he had balls, which is kind of interesting when you realize that there's definitely a shortage of food. So how this was put together is a bit of a mystery. The Indians, he faced the same problem as Bienville did. Indian raids in 1747 on the east bank of the Mississippi River, south of Baton Rouge. In 1748, they raided again, killing and plundering as they went. A lot of the settlers on the outside, he lost support because he sent militia to attack the Indians and not to protect the colonists themselves. They weren't sure that that's what was needed. Indian raids of 1752, another assault. This time, Vaudreuil sent 700 soldiers into the Indian Territory. And then this time, he took it a step further. He destroyed the villages and he burned all of their crops. The Indians then sued for peace because they realized that he had so totally disrupted their ability to survive that they had to sue for peace. They had no food, and their agricultural production had been so upset. There was a promise of no food for the coming winter. So, having achieved that, he finally browbeat the local Indians into surrendering and stopping these raids against the settlers on the outside. For that, he gained support. The economy, very little improvement to the economy because there was no ships coming in. There was no trade taking place. So very little could be done to make things better. Production did increase. There was some cotton, but remember, you don't have any way of really getting the seeds out. So it's very expensive proposition producing cotton. They produced tobacco, but it wasn't the sweet southeastern tobacco that you found in Virginia and in the Carolinas. This was a much more harsher tobacco. I remember as a high school student, I was working for flying time at the airport. And at that time, Louisiana had Picayune cigarettes. And people would see them, they were so unique, they would buy them. And then they would give them to me, ask me if I smoked, and there'd be one cigarette missing because it was so strong. Louisiana tobacco was never really attractive. And then indigo production. This is the beginning of indigo. Indigo is the blue product that's made, for instance, in blue jeans. It's a blue dye. You grow the crops. When they reach their maturity, you harvest them and you boil them in water. And what comes out is this blue liquid mixed with the water. After you've crushed it, you stepped in it like you do grapes, and you worked it to get as much out of it. You extract that, the raw material, all the leaves and everything, and then you boil down the liquid until you extract as much water as you can. And what's left is a thick paste of blue, which you place in wooden molds, let it dry, and you end up with cakes of dye, blue dye. The downside to that was, which people didn't know, is that slaves would start getting sick from working with this. And the reason was cyanide. In the production of indigo, you get a small, small trace of cyanide, which penetrates through the skin and any open wound you might have. The problem with cyanide is once it's in the body, it doesn't leave. So it accumulates, and over time, it reaches a critical mass where it becomes deadly. And that's when slaves will start becoming sick and die. And no one understood what the process was. There was some improvement in raising rice, corn, and vegetables. So they're starting to feed themselves under Vaudreuil. But it wasn't totally self-sufficient. So it needed imports which weren't available. So they had to trade with Indians, what little they had. So the colony is still very much in an economic crisis under Vaudreuil. It had a rich social life, very little food and very little of anything else. The situation in 1744, the colony had 3,000 white inhabitants, 800 soldiers, and 2,000 slaves. So you can really see that between slaves and soldiers, that accounted for almost half of what the population would be. Had a population of New Orleans of 1,100 people, including 300 slaves. The decline in population since the colony had turned over to the crown in 1731. So unlike in the New England colonies, the British colonies, which by 1750 had grown to 1.5 million, you're now stuck in France with the French experience here in Louisiana of maybe 6,000, counting slaves. So you can see from the very beginning, in 1699 to here we are in 1744. Very little growth. The colony is suffering. Few settlers came in the 1740s. Why would you possibly come? In 1751, 60 young women were brought here. Possibly they were brought by the nuns, and they were soon married. Married couples were then given land, seed, a cow, a calf, and some chickens, and some supplies for 3 years, with the hope that this investment would pay off and that they would have functioning farms and the colony would soon become self-sufficient. But trade languished. They became dependent upon British smugglers bringing goods in, which is a sad state of affair, because France was confronting the British and trying to limit the British influence into their area, while at the same time slowly becoming dependent upon the British trade carried on through smuggling. Military discipline steadily declined. Soldiers sold wine and brandy to the Indians and the slaves for money because they hadn't been paid. This is a quote from Vaudreuil. Never been so bad. Nearly every month, some soldier was executed on a capital offense. This lack of discipline was general. Every freedom was allowed to these rogues as long as they spent their money at the canteen, which was run by an officer who shared the profits with the major, and even, it was said, the governor himself. So this is a report talking about the colony. Drunkenness, brawls, duels, and other disorders were persistent. In the 1750s, Louisiana was a totally demoralized colony. After now 50 years of French colonial control, it lacked industry, commerce, and agriculture. The capital city became more than ever a resort of the vicious, the criminal elements of a population who devoted themselves to stealing, brawling, drinking in the pot houses, taverns, and gambling dens, which made their appearance along the river and on the edges of the swamp. Madame Vaudreuil turned her relatives, and any jobs that were available she gave to her relatives and close friends. Monopolies were granted to them. So you now find that Madame Vaudreuil behind the scenes is conducting a much corrupt operation. She sold army supplies and replaced them with cheaper goods, forced merchants to buy from her or suffer the consequences. Most colonists hated her. Only the wealthy found her entertaining because they were invited to the balls and the dances and what have you. But despite the reports of rampant corruption by the Vaudreuils, their political connections in France were strong enough to protect them. That is one of the tragedies of the time, that there's nothing they could do to shake this authority over them because they were loved in France. They had deep, deep, deep family connections in the royalty. So as a result, the memory of the corruption is gone, but the memory of the Grand Marquis, who lived an extravagant lifestyle and had parties and balls, and his wife and her carriage are the image that's left, but it in no way ties to the reality of the world they lived in. Louis Billiard, Cavalier de Carillac, is the last French governor. He gave him a highly ceremonious inaugural banquet, which one can expect. That's the way he was. A stupendous ball. 200 guests were invited, wine fountains for the common folk, 2 lighted doves flew to light a fireworks display. Appointed because of his strong military background. Carillac was a captain for 25 years in the Navy, and he bore the wounds to demonstrate his commitment to public service. His tenure was marked at the end, and during his tenure, by the French and Indian War. We'll get into this a little bit more in a bit, but the French and Indian War erupted in the Ohio Valley when the conflict between the English expanding to the west ran into the French, who had already occupied that area, and it ignited into what would later become its own world war, which France would lose. Carillac attacked the Indian problem first. He criticized them for the disloyalty to the French and urged them to discontinue their trade with the British. As a result, where he could, he found better goods and traded with them, because he realized the fundamental problem was that the British were giving the Indians better goods, better trade. So why should they remain loyal to the French? That's all they were interested in Europeans for anyway, is for what they could give them. He worked hard with the Choctaws and would later become known as the father of the Choctaws because of his great efforts to solve the problems with them and to help solve some of the Choctaws' problems. He wanted better troops, but instead, all he got was Swiss guards. He stationed an old ship at the mouth of the river with the intention of sinking it if need be at the mouth of the river to protect it from an invasion. He's a military Navy guy. France, by this time, has completely washed its hands of Louisiana. It can't be bothered, especially now that the French and Indian War is going on. Their effort is trying to maintain their very rich and powerful Canadian provinces against British assaults. Louis XV was completely preoccupied with these wars and also the pleasures of being the king and court life. He had things good with his wife, his concubines, his good food, and living the life of a king. The army now drops to 300 men. The rest was sent to Canada to help in the support the French against the British incursion into the Ohio Valley. There was a rebellion on Cat Island, which he immediately had to put down. Cat Island was a prison island where he had sent the discontented people. They rebelled and formed a very violent operation, which he had to militarily suppress. A cabal of officers then worked against him and spread discord because of his attempts to bring about discipline in the army. The militia he could not depend upon. So, despite the fact that he had a strong military background, the situation among the army in Louisiana was such that he could not impose the authority as a military officer that he thought he could without being confronted with a counterattack by his officer corps. Additionally, the Jesuits and the Capuchins, the two Catholic groups, were involved in a practical religious war. So everywhere he turned, there was chaos in the Louisiana colony. It was become a total mess. And as a result, the living conditions for the common people had become even worse. As I mentioned, the French and Indian War arose over a dispute in the Ohio Valley. It soon would turn to a world war because the conditions there, the British and the French would fight it out. The British then would turn to the Germans to open up a battle against the French in Europe and offered to pay for it. So the French suddenly find themselves not only fighting in the New World against the British, but also having to contend with the Germans on the continent. It was more than they could handle. Louisiana would become subjected to a blockade from the British, which then prevented any ships to come to the support of the colonists living here, so conditions got even worse. And France lacked any resources to supply Louisiana, much less the military power to break a British blockade and bring that supply through. So as a result, the French colony languished in isolation. This war would go on for 7 years, which France would eventually have to surrender and lose. This is the results of the French and Indian War. Everything you see here in black becomes British. Everything you see here in stripe becomes Spanish. And the only thing that's French is half of an island, Saint-Domingue, today's Haiti. Everything else has been discarded. And we'll get into a little discussion of that next time. So I hope you found it interesting. So this is how the administration of the French end. And next time we'll talk about how the Spanish arrive. Y'all take care and do enjoy.